All right, welcome everybody. As I say, it's just past 10 o'clock, so we'll honour our start time. So welcome to this glorious day, the 2nd of May, where I'm in Sydney, and it's a stunning day in Sydney. So I'm hoping that wherever you are, it's equally as stunning. Let me start though by acknowledging the traditional custodians of these wonderful lands where we are and where we work and live. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders. Okay, hi, I'm Michael Morgan, CEO of Herman Asia. And today is a really exciting webinar that we're about to launch. But just before we do, what I'd love each one of you to do is in the chat, would you just write where you are? What stunning bit of countryside are you in, so we can just get a feel for the spread and the breadth of where people are. So we've got a couple in Sydney. So we'll look at that as we go along. So I'm Michael, as I say, CEO of Herman, and over the years I've done quite a few webinars, and this one, promises to be a little bit different and obviously equally as stunning as the day. And I'm really excited because it's going to take me into a world that I actually don't have much experience in, and that's the world of boards, of executive boards and of directors. But luckily, we do have somebody who has a wealth of experience in this area, and that's Suzanne. Give us a wave, Suzanne. Suzanne Schultz from a company called Directors Australia. Now, just before I hand over to Suzanne, this webinar will probably go for, I'd say, 40 minutes. We are recording it, so in case you have to go or whatever, we'll make sure you get a recording afterwards. And Suzanne is going to do most of the talking as she goes through the presentation, and I'll be firing questions at her. Now, if you have any questions as we go along, please put them into the Q&A down the bottom, and we'll either knock them off on the way through, or we'll have a period of time at the end where we can go through. So, Suzanne, to get us started, I guess, who is Directors Australia? And you call yourself, I think, a board and governance specialist. So what on earth is that?
Thank you, Michael. It's really great to have the opportunity to talk with everybody today about how whole brain thinking relates to operating effectively as a board. Directors Australia is a specialist board consultancy organisation. We operate across Australia, primarily on the East Coast, and we have 3 main areas where we work. So recruitment for boards, it's a different kind of recruitment, and so we have networks all across Australia to find those specialist skills that a board might be looking for. We also provide company secretariat support for boards, because that's a particular area where there's a great need for high quality support. And of course, the board advisory area, which is where I work. So board advisory concentrates on board evaluations, as well as providing some of the most up-to-date information about what boards are thinking about and how boards need to operate. So we provide an advisory service. And my particular area, the area that I love, is how boards work together. So I've been on boards pretty much my whole life. I'm really, really, really interested in what good governance looks and feels like and contributing to that. Okay. And I'm a psychologist. And so, so I'm interested in how the board can work together effectively in order to deliver the best outcome for the organisation.
All right. Well, I mean, in my career, I spent a lifetime, I guess, running workshops, facilitating sessions for every sort of team, group, that you can imagine, from top down, bottom up, and everything else. Are boards any different to that?
Interestingly, they are, Michael. Boards are a bit different because there's no one in charge. There is no ultimate decision maker. The board has to operate as a whole in order to make decisions in the best interests of the organisation. So what that means is a high level of humility, bringing our best and being accountable, responsible, curious and effective.
Can I?
So it is different.
Yeah, can I interrupt there? You use an interesting word, humility, to say I'm not as I already said, an expert in boards, but I have met quite a few, members of boards and directors, and the humility is not a word that comes to mind.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michael. And probably that's the biggest lesson for very senior executives who are used to making decisions and being accountable to the board, to be able to step away from that and say, I am no longer in charge. I am contributing as part of a group. So I'm responsible and accountable, but I must learn humility in order to be an equal amongst my colleagues.
Okay, that's a tough job. Now, I know in doing that, you've often used the phrase, board dynamics. So I guess you're now going to tell me, that because of that and that shared leadership, or perhaps lack of leadership, that the dynamics are challenging.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, let me walk through some of the things that we were going to talk about today about board dynamics and what they are. So essentially, board dynamics are the way that we come together as a board. The people on the board come together and how we communicate, how we listen, how we ask questions, how we respect each other, and make it safe to challenge without being inappropriate or and in maintaining respect. So that sounds pretty simple and something that many of us take for granted, but actually it isn't always that straightforward. And people come to us to ask about supporting their board dynamics, often when they're frustrated, when things aren't going smoothly, or when there are brand new board members. One of the things that we found in conversations with boards is that it can take sometimes up to a year for somebody to bring their best self to the board, because for all kinds of reasons. So they might know that they have something to contribute, but they want to sit back and be quiet until they feel confident that they're on top of the decisions that are being made.
And I guess it takes 12 months, doesn't it? Because boards don't meet every day either. So
that's exactly right. So by one of the times when using a board dynamics process, or, spending time together in order to build that trust, you can actually speed up the effectiveness of the whole board and get a real and genuine contribution from the new board member from possibly the second meeting. So that's the kind of times where people come to us. And so board dynamics is about allowing the best of the board members to come out in order for people to be able to deliver on their duties, for them to be able to ask good questions, contribute their knowledge, and lead the board effectively. So that's what board dynamics is all about. And I wanted to just start with a poll. So these are some of the things where boards aren't necessarily operating as they should be. So I'm going to start this poll, and I'd love to hear from you whether or not you've come across some of these things. So can everybody see the poll? Yep.
Yep, I can.
You can choose as many as you like. So for those of you who have had experience on boards.
Okay, that top one is certainly scoring well.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Yes, and
Yes.
silence doesn't seem to be a big thing.
Yes, and also interestingly, the one about everyone on the board coming from the same profession, it's interesting. Some of the boards that we work with, the constitution or the structure of the board requirements actually requires that people come from a single profession. And so that can inhibit the board dynamics from that perspective. But that one's the lowest. But yes, a director dominating the discussion is probably one of the biggest things. So thank you for sharing your experiences. And for many of us, all of these can come up. Great. Thank you. So these are some of the reasons why people come to us, is to see whether or not something can be done to be able to support the board to work more effectively together. So
Okay, so yeah, I mean, there's a need, therefore, for us or for you to do something in the board. So tell us more about what you call board dynamics, I guess.
Yeah. So I've just had a couple more things here about when it makes sense for the board to have a look at board dynamics, but we've talked about that a little bit. So board dynamics are the way that the board operates as a decision-making body. So the humanity of the people coming into the boardroom mean that our personal styles and backgrounds can either put other people off or we can be put off, and so therefore we can't be our best in the boardroom. The nature of the work, so often board meetings are quite focused and intense. There's a lot of reading, there's a lot of decisions that need to be made. Some people are particularly interested in a particular area and not so much in others. So the nature of the board's work affects the dynamics. The working relationship that people have with other people can make a difference to how open and effective people are, and also the environment in which the board is operating. For example, right at the moment, interest rates are climbing. The financial impact on boards is growing. The responsibility of board members individually continues to go up. So that environment creates a bit of a pressure cooker where that can affect the effectiveness of people. So all of those things affect what dynamics are. And one of the things that we did as we were looking at developing this piece of work, where we have been working with boards, is to look at why would you even bother to pay attention to board dynamics? Don't they just work out for themselves?
Can I just interrupt?
Yes.
I'm just reading that slide. It says boards that are able to function effectively as a team have an 800% greater impact. That's a Trump-like figure. I mean,
it really is. It comes from America. So this is a piece of research from Harvard Business Review. And the particular thing that they were focusing on, which is not surprising given that this research comes from the US, they were looking at financial results. And of course, financial results are not the only thing that a board needs to pay attention to. But what they found was that if the board could bring their best, if every individual board member could bring their best and speak and listen and ask the right questions, the results for the organization were profoundly improved.
Yeah. I mean,
and you're right.
Significant.
I try not to say that 800% number because that, that seems unrealistic. But I guess the point of this research is it's worth investing in how we work together in order to be able to lead effectively. Because good governance makes a tremendous difference to our community, particularly for not-for-profit boards, for our effectiveness as a nation with our listed boards, and also for our government boards that are operating across Australia. So So what boards need, and we've talked about this quite a lot, is diversity, so that we do bring different perspectives. If everybody's just singing along and saying yes to the same things, then one of the things that we know is that a board can build a sense of hubris. So everything's going well, nobody's having a challenging conversation, and then all of a sudden something happens and the board's not able to respond. Common meaning gives you a chance to really understand that the reason I'm here is for the interests of the organisation. It's very interesting when one of the things that we found with board dynamics is if you are elected or chosen or recruited because of your particular expertise or your background or your state or your region, some board members bring that to the board table. So I'm operating for the best interests of New South Wales. So spending time on looking at the common meaning, bringing that understanding that you are not here for New South Wales, you are here to operate in the best interests of this organisation.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to be a hard one, hasn't it? Because, I mean, my understanding is that a lot of board members are members of more than one board, and they're often business people in their own right. So they bring a tremendous lot of, I'm going to say baggage, but they would probably think experience and knowledge, but that's not necessarily what they're there for.
Well, interestingly, it is, and it's possible to hold both. So when we choose to or are recruited to a board, we are absolutely invited to bring our knowledge, our experience, our history, our perspective, our particular thinking style. That's why we're here. The difference is that why am I here? It's for the best interests of this organisation. Yeah. So while I'm in this room, I'm in this place, and I'm focusing on this organisation. So, and that's one of the reasons why we found that the whole brain thinking approach is really powerful as a conversation starter, but we'll come to that.
Yeah.
Building on that, so healthy board dynamics allow every member of the board to be aligned with the purpose so that they can make sound decisions, and that leads to measurable outcomes. So that's how the flow of that 800% improvement happens, because we're spending time just realigning ourselves with why we're here and how we can bring our best to the board table. So we've had a bit of a conversation about when board dynamics are going wrong and what are unhealthy board dynamics. So, you know, it's worth spending a bit of time talking about what are healthy board dynamics. So trust and respect. So I feel safe to bring my knowledge, experience, skills and questions to the table. I trust that my colleagues will listen and respect my perspective. I know when to be quiet and when to speak up. And it allows us to make collective decisions, be constructive and productive. One of the lovely lines that I really like about how it is to be in a boardroom is to disagree and challenge without being disagreeable, to have courage, expand thinking and creativity. We have so much going on in our businesses and organisations around Australia that it really needs for us to bring our best selves to the board table, to have clear thinking, to be able to challenge. Things are changing. What we did yesterday is not going to work tomorrow. So there is no room for complacency or floating along.
Yeah.
So
I love that where you say, you know, disagree without being disagreeable.
Yes. And, you know, for a healthy board, it actually feels like fun to have to disagree and to really push to a decision that wouldn't have been made possible if it were just one person with the, you know, the best knowledge or the best background to make that decision. Somebody with a different perspective can actually push to a solution that wouldn't otherwise have been possible.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that probably leading into this slide and the next, obviously I know that you integrate whole brain thinking into, your approach to board dynamics. So can you begin to, I guess, comment on that, how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Directors Australia, we've been looking at for quite a number of years, what is the right tool to start a conversation about dynamics that is not personal, it's not a personality test, it doesn't judge every individual. We were looking for something that would be simple, clean, clear, to have a conversation about how we relate to each other, how we communicate with each other, how we ask questions, and to respect differences. And so what the research tells us and what we've learned is that in order to improve board dynamics, you need to start with a baseline. So where are we at the moment? So what is our dynamic like? Have a frank and fearless look at how our board is operating. And it's one of the reasons why we work in board evaluations a lot. Ensure that we have the right people at the table, so the right skills, the right motivation, that the context is right, we have the right people at the table. That's why we work in recruitment. And then the third area is to focus on building that board as a team, and everybody has a different, it's not even like a sport team where everyone has a role, because there's room to move. But what you're doing is to build the team's capacity to kick the goal, which is making the decision that is going to lead the organisation forward. And sometimes those decisions need to be made very quickly, for example, COVID or a financial incident. And sometimes they need to be made for the long term, because in 30 years' time, the current environmental impacts are going to affect the way we do business. So the benefits of spending time in this area are measurable, and they affect the bottom line, whatever the bottom line happens to be for your organisation. So the way that we do it, and as you said, thank you for the invitation to talk about how we do this at Directors Australia. So the rapidly changing environment means that that it's useful to have some tools. So the way that we work with boards is to have a look at the organisational demands. It's not done on an island. Every organisation has its own impacts. We ask people to use the whole brain thinking survey to look at their thinking preferences. And then we collate that information, so we can, people get to choose whether or not they want to be visible or not visible. But what we do is to have a look at how everybody's thinking preference lays out. Then we facilitate a workshop with the board to have a conversation about how we're working, where the gaps are, what each individual thinks could be done to work more effectively. And then we provide the advisory support and a program for continued development. So it's not a one-off thing. People don't change the way they work and build trust in a 3-hour workshop. But the whole brain thinking, which I'm going to speak through a little bit more in a moment, gives a language and a structure to have a respectful conversation about how to give feedback to somebody else about how they're operating in the board, and also to hear the feedback in a way that doesn't feel like an attack.
And I guess it's also something that you hope will stay in the boardroom when you're not there. Absolutely.
And probably another reason why we chose whole brain thinking is that the tool's been used through organisations really widely in Australia and overseas. And so often the executive team or the senior management team or even the whole organisation has used this tool. So it's another way to facilitate conversations that are respectful and non-personal about how you are behaving around here.
Yeah, and that can be, I mean, that can be critical, can't it? Because the board does not operate in isolation. The board talks to the executive. So they, if they actually know what's going on, it makes it much more effective.
Much more effective. And the board works with and through the CEO. The CEO is leading the executive. They're all trying, the board is, you know, setting the direction, and the executive are trying to deliver on that. And if somebody's particular perspective or style makes me feel attacked or defensive, it makes it pretty hard for me to deliver. So it's really, we found it really powerful as a way to have these respectful conversations.
Yeah.
So let me talk a little bit about whole brain thinking and what it all is. So normally when I'm talking with people about whole brain thinking, they haven't heard of it. And I imagine that given that so many of the people who are joining our webinar today already know what whole brain thinking is, I'll still talk about it just a little bit and why we chose it from a board perspective. So you can see here that boards are often very busy. So as you said, they might have particular directors may have another role, or they may be on several boards. And so, so they don't want to do something that takes 45 minutes and requires a 2-hour debrief. So we wanted something that was simple and fast to complete, but sophisticated in its application to provide information for the board. So this is how it looks from a colour and a letter perspective. So so this is what the survey talks about, and it's a different way of thinking. So you can see that none of this feels like a personal attack. It doesn't say you're an accountant or you're a lawyer or you're an engineer. It says based on this assessment, it seems that your natural place, your most comfortable place, is in one or two or all four of these thinking preferences. And so that's often the kinds of questions that you're most likely to be able to be asking and the kind of information that you're wanting to hear. And so as for each individual person, they get to see their individual thinking preferences map. And as we know, there's no good profile, no bad profile. What we want is to bring the strength of this thinking, all of the thinking preferences, to the kinds of decisions that the board needs to make. And it beautifully maps to the roles and responsibilities of the board. And I'll come to that in a moment. You look like you want to ask a question, Michael.
Well, I'm getting excited because I guess when I think of boards, I think of, you know, the word diversity. And I think where you're headed, obviously, is that if you don't have mental diversity, you're going to perhaps have a problem.
Absolutely. And if we just while we're on this slide, if we think about it, often people who have had a very strong, long executive career, or they've worked in finances or law, which is often traditionally what we think of for board directors, there's a long history and tradition of thinking in the blue quadrant. And if we only operate in the blue quadrant, we might make very logical, sound decisions. But it may be that we're not prepared for the future, which is where the yellow quadrant operates. So where are we going? What's happening now? How do we integrate all of the information we're getting at the moment? Are we thinking about the effect of this decision on our customers, on our staff, on our stakeholders, on the community? And what could go wrong if we don't think about those questions? And of course, it's always handy to have somebody on the board who looks at line 39 and goes, that doesn't look right. So yes, I think you're right. Diversity is really powerful. These you know, examples of people from history don't suit everybody. We just picked a few to examples of people, and the, you know, whether or not this 4-person board made up of Isaac Newton, Julius Caesar, Leonardo da Vinci, and Mother Teresa would make a great board. So the common language is something that I talked about earlier. We want to be able to give people some language that helps them to think about how all of the things that the board needs to take responsibility for are covered. And you can see that we've mapped in the central image that a lot of the yellow thinking relates to strategy. That's a really important part of the board's role. Where are we going? All of those kinds of things. You really need to think about people. So, for example, one of the things that the board is particularly interested in is, are we complying with our legal responsibilities? For example, keeping our people safe at work. So if we are looking at the outcomes of that, which might be in the green thinking or the blue thinking, so how are we doing? How many accidents did we have? That's all very well, but if we didn't pay attention to training and shifting behaviour, then nothing's going to change. We can keep having the policy and measuring the outcome and not necessarily get the kind of impact that we want to have.
Yeah, Deborah's just asked a question about, I guess, the ongoing use of whole brain thinking by boards. You know, it's one thing to come in and do a workshop, it's another, you know, for that lingering effect. And I think if I understand what you do, is it the trigger model is a way that you can kind of integrate whole brain thinking, you know, into those, I guess, the very work that the board has to do.
Absolutely. And there's probably two ways that you can really build it into the way that you work as a board. And I'm going to talk through a couple of them. One of them is we don't just run the workshop and then leave you to it. What we do is follow up in 6 months' time and have another conversation. And what we tend to do at the second time is to apply it to a real decision that the board is actually making at the moment and apply the different thinking preferences to that decision. So have we taken into account all of these areas, and who most naturally at the board is going to be paying attention to those? And if no one is naturally paying attention, do we want to bring in somebody who does naturally pay attention to those areas? Or do we want to stretch our own thinking as a board into that area? So that's how we do it, is by, you know, building the pattern and the language, working sometimes with the CEO or the chair or somebody else in the board who's happy to take carriage of using this tool to improve the decisions of the board. So I've said already why we chose, but I will say it again. The reason that we chose whole brain thinking with our approach is because for the lawyers and the accountants, and I know I shouldn't use a stereotype because that's not fair, but for people with a very strong factual, logical, evidence-based background, they want to know that this tool is valid, it's research-based, it's clear. And people who have a preference in the for detail want to know that it can be applied quickly and effectively. People who really like to look at the big picture want to know that it's simple. I don't want to be judged, and I want to have the capacity to grow out of, you know, spending my 15 minutes on completing the survey. I want to get some benefit from it. And of course, to want to know that it's a positive process. Board dynamics can feel like we're going to punish the people who are not behaving well. What we really want, the reason we chose HBDI is it's a positive, future focused, let's see how we can improve. And it's about driving the business. So that's why we chose whole brain thinking. And Michael, you mentioned the trigger model. So the trigger model's been around for a really, really long time. And we keep coming back to it because it's a simple visual way to outline the duties, responsibilities of a director. And so it's divided into these dimensions of our external focus as a board and our internal focus as a board. So external meaning what we deliver, internal meaning within our own organisation. We need to look at the present and the past, and we also need to look at the future. And with all of these things, we need to work with and through the CEO. And what's beautiful that we noticed when we used the HBDI is that it maps very, very, very neatly into these 4 thinking quadrants. And so and I'll start at A, which is the blue quadrant. People who have a natural thinking preference, or when they spend time in their thinking preference related to blue, it's facts and show me the numbers. That's very powerful for providing accountability. So when we're reporting to shareholders, making sure that we are following the law, looking at the finances, those of us at the board who love being in this place are going to ask really great questions and pay a lot of attention. And so you can see all the way through how that maps. So when we look at boards' effectiveness, one of the things that we find, is on a objective basis, if you look at a typical board agenda, most of the time for most boards is spent in the blue quadrant. And the gap, or the part that often gets left to less and left to last, or tried to be done once a year, if a board isn't paying real attention to the full range of duties and responsibilities, is the yellow area. So doing innovation and strategy once a year is not really helpful for the kind of world that we live in and the kinds of businesses that we're running. So the value of using the trigger model, applying the thinking preferences, is you can ask the board with particular thinking preferences to use their gifts to bring back the conversation to all 4 of the quadrants at the right time, and to have a look at the agenda, to have a look at the papers, to have a look at the way that the company secretariat works, to look at how the executive team are providing papers, to try and make sure that we are equally covering past and future, present and future, and external and internal. It's not easy to do that just through a natural flow, particularly when you have a board whose natural thinking preferences and also their belief about their duties and responsibilities. If you stay too much in the blue, you're going to put your organisation at risk. So that's why we think whole brain thinking is really powerful for effective boards.
Okay, Luke's asked a question actually on that point. If whole brain thinking, as you say, is so powerful and it integrates beautifully with the trigger model, and presumably an effective board, is referring or using the trigger model all the time and so forth, have you found, I guess, nirvana after 6 months to boards when you come back into a board? Or is it the normal thing? Some boards have picked it up really well and others, perhaps haven't.
Every board is made up of human beings, and we all have our natural place where we settle back and we go back into old habits. So anytime anyone who's worked in organizational change, anytime we're trying to grow and get better, it takes work and it takes focus and it takes energy. And so, as you say, interestingly, one of the boards that we worked with that is, top of mind for me at the moment, they did use it, and what they started to do was to actually use the 4 quadrants to ask questions on key decisions, and so they were starting to build the habit. And so that's, as I said, that's why we come back in 6 months, is habits take time to change. So no magical nirvana, we're all human, but our passion at Directors Australia is to help boards to keep getting better. Because it makes a huge difference to our world. Okay,
and I guess boards are no different, as I say, to any other group or whatever, that we might sit here and say, whole brain thinking is the way to go. But I guess, again, boards are like most other teams, they're actually not whole brain. And I believe you use our preference maps to kind of show that.
That's right. I thought I'd bring along for our webinar today an example of what a board can look like and what impact that has. And that's actually quite illuminating when we have the conversation with boards. So This is a map of a real board. And you can see that there's for this particular board, quite a lot of detail. So paying attention to line 39 on the budget, quite a lot of logic. So so on the left side, mostly a couple of people who are trying to bring the conversation back to the future and innovation and where are we going next. And not many people on this particular board paying attention to what could be the impact on our employees, on our stakeholders, on our customers. I mean, a classic question is, do our KPIs and remuneration systems reward the right behaviour from our leaders? And we know the stories from the Royal Commission where there was one of the boards quite famously was getting almost double the financial return from their services than anyone else in the market. And everyone was congratulating themselves and nobody stopped to ask a question about how.
Yeah. Just on that, Henry's asked a question, how representative is this map of boards, or are they all different all over the place? Is there a trend?
There is a trend, and it's not surprising, although I think we're shifting. So what I mean by that is it seems that we keep coming back, or, you know, in the olden days, in order to get on a board, you need to have been a successful CEO that delivered results, a lawyer, so you could keep the company safe and make sure that we're following the law, an accountant, because we're all personally responsible for the finances of the organisation. And and then once you have those three figures, then they tend to choose people like themselves where they feel safe and comfortable. So we have developed a trend which does err toward blue and green.
Yes. Yeah.
There's been a really strong push over the last 10 or 20 years to try and get diversity onto the board, both from a background and a skills and agenda and a perspective point of view. So, for example, if we want somebody with a yellow brain thinking, I know there are boards who have actively looked for somebody who's had a background in creative arts, for example. Or if we're looking for somebody to pay attention to our customers, we might be looking for somebody with a background in human services.
Yeah, yeah.
Even though our core business might be financial services. So, so yes, this is a fairly typical board, and by paying attention to the whole brain model, I said right back at the beginning when we were looking at board dynamics, is first have a look at how is our board operating, so board evaluation. Second, look at who is at the table, and that's where this comes in. And it doesn't mean that you would use HBDI as a recruitment tool, but you can think about what kinds of professions, backgrounds, knowledge, qualifications, experience might give us somebody who's going to pay attention to those particular areas.
Okay. Matt's asked a question, I guess, in that vein. From your experience as a facilitator with boards, is there one quadrant that's harder, if you like, to bring enlightenment to than others, or are they all equally as challenging?
So unsurprisingly, and you will know this, Michael, all of us find it most comfortable to speak and communicate with people who have a similar thinking preference to ourselves. So it just flows. So, for example, just, you know, not so much as a facilitator, but if I'm on a board and we're all blue thinkers, decisions happen fast, they're effective, we all agree, we know how to speak to each other, and everything goes very smoothly, but we don't necessarily get the same outcome. That's true for us as facilitators too. So what it means as a facilitator is that I need to really stretch myself in the thinking preferences that aren't my natural thinking preferences, so that I can listen and respond and engage with people around the room. Yeah. So on the one hand, if one of my colleagues is almost perfectly balanced across the 4 thinking preferences. So, so she's able to move through, but she might not be as strong in her thinking preferences in one of those areas. To disclose, my natural thinking preference is pretty yellow and red. And so I need to make sure that when I'm delivering or responding to questions or facilitating a workshop, I need to make sure that I cover detail and logic and evidence in order to bring the board along with the conversation.
Yeah, okay. We're getting where, yeah, it's 11:15, so we're up against, I guess,
no
time.
problems. We're nearly done.
But also we're getting an avalanche of questions, and I don't know whether we can get to them all, but a lot of questions, I guess, around this ongoing application, ongoing use. And for instance, if you have switched the board on to using the whole brain model as a lens, I mean, have you successfully used that lens, if you like, to drive the strategy and ended up with all the ticks in all the boxes?
We have, and I will show you that. I'll just very quickly mention, It's always interesting to see how a board operates under pressure. So those of you who know the whole brain model, you can see where people shift. And when there's conflict or tension or urgency, some people can change quite a bit, and that can make a difference. And it's useful from an insight perspective for boards to acknowledge that for themselves. So yes, indeed, this is an example of a decision that a board needs to make and using the lens to make that decision. So looking at a merger acquisition decision. So traditionally we might spend a lot of time in blue. So what's the price, the value, P&L, technical elements, efficiency and cost. If we want to make a better decision where we don't end up, and so I know a lot of organisations where the financial and logical decision about a merger or acquisition made great sense on paper, but the cultural fit was a disaster, and the business failed as a result of it. So, having a look at those kinds of things. So. What's the fit from the perspective of future? Are we all going to go together into where we need to go? Is that going to fit to where we want to go and where they want to go? What does it feel like? That's not a conversation that traditionally happens at the board. What's our gut feel about how well we're going to fit with this organisation? And also just making sure that the timeline is well organised, that there are details. And even if the board's not going to get involved in checklists and data and all of those kinds of things, but they may well ask the question, what is the timeline? Is somebody paying attention to the details of this? So we don't just launch from our great logical discussion. So yes, use it. This is a really, really simple tool to say, what is the decision and what kinds of questions might we be asking from a whole brain perspective. And this is my last slide. And if we do have a couple of minutes to answer more questions, I'm really happy to. But this is what we do, and we love what we do. And yes, we have seen an impact, because decisions are better when the board considers, how am I showing up to this decision and bringing my knowledge, my skills to get the best outcome.
Okay, terrific. Well, is it appropriate for you to whack your email in the chat? Because we do have a couple of questions that we haven't got to, because you've certainly stirred up, say, a lot of interest.
I would love to.
Okay.
And yeah, well, I think we do have a couple of minutes if there's another question that you think covers what people are interested in, Michael.
Well, we've got a couple of questions, I guess, about using the HBDI with applicants. And that's a question we get, whether it's with boards or whatever. And our official position is no, the HBDI is not a selection tool. However, I use it every time with onboarding, and it's absolutely critical to use that.
And as I mentioned, we at Directors Australia, we do a lot of board recruitment. That's a really important area of our work. And we pay attention to thinking preferences without using the HBDI.
Yeah. And Sharon's asked a question, which I guess is less about boards, more about the HBDI. It's about, what does under pressure mean? And for us, I guess, under pressure means when you're making a decision that's really important, then sometimes your thinking shifts. For instance, what are you going to have for lunch is not a critical decision, so you would make that decision under your normal thinking preference. But, should I invest in this stock? Which school should I send my children to? Sometimes those really important decisions, people change a little bit under pressure. And to your point, hopefully being on a board is a pressure situation where you've got to really think carefully about those decisions.
Yeah, and thank you, Michael. And the reason that that's important is that if I'm normally looking for the logic and the evidence-based, and suddenly we need to shut down half our operations because we don't have enough staff, and under pressure, my preference goes to yellow and I start to get emotional. It's useful for other board members to know that, because it just gives you more information about how to look out for each other and to be respectful.
Yep. Okay. Ooh. Thank you for that. I started by, I guess, introducing today's topic, and I said it's a world that I don't have much experience in, and I introduced everybody to Suzanne, who does have enormous experience. So, Suzanne, let me ask, to summarize, if you had to summarize absolutely everything you've said in 3 lines, 3 points, what should we leave this webinar with lingering in our minds? 3 things.
Paying attention to how your board works together and putting effort into it will yield more results than so many other things. Having an external facilitator or a specialist to come and provide that advice depersonalizes it and makes a big difference. And it's actually quite fun to spend time with your board members in order to work more effectively together. Okay.
Fabulous. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, everybody, for coming. As I said, it's a stunning day in Sydney, and I'm sure it's a stunning day where we all are. And Suzanne, thank you for a stunning webinar.
Lovely. And I'd love to hear from you if you're interested in learning more about it, and also for your board or your future board.
Yeah. Okay, and if anybody wants to know more, you know where we are. Okay, so bye-bye.